Mark Harris was the proud father everyone thought they knew, and Emily Harris was the quiet daughter no one ever truly saw. In a Florida suburb where life looked ordinary, their story would end in horror, when the family's two Rottweilers turned from loyal pets into killers, and a father's secrets led to charges that shocked the entire nation. The neighborhood looked like something from a postcard, lined with palm trees swaying in the humid Florida air. Houses neatly stacked side by side, each one carrying the marks of quiet family life. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged waves from driveways, where children darted back and forth between yards, and where the biggest concern on most evenings was who left their trash cans out too long. It was, in many ways, an ordinary suburban community, tucked away from the chaos of the city. But beneath that polished surface, one family stood out, not for wealth or scandal, but for an unease people could never quite put into words. Mark Harris lived at the edge of the cul-de-sac in a pale yellow house with peeling paint. He was a single father raising his 12-year-old daughter, Emily, after his wife had left suddenly years before. To the neighbors, Mark was distant, a man who kept to himself. He rarely joined the block barbecues or attended school events. Most of the time, people saw him walking in the yard, training his two Rottweilers. Their sleek, muscular frames and sharp eyes made passers-by uncomfortable, especially when the dogs lunged at the fence with teeth bared. Mark, however, treated them like prized possessions, speaking proudly of their power and discipline. For Mark, the dogs were more than pets. They were a statement, an extension of his control and his identity. He often boasted about their lineage, their strength, and how fiercely protective they were. Yet, their protectiveness sometimes tipped into menace. Delivery drivers avoided the house after a few close encounters, and neighborhood children crossed the street rather than walk past the Harris property. Complaints to animal control surfaced now and then, but Mark always had an explanation ready. The dogs were just misunderstood, he claimed, or they were reacting to strangers trespassing too close. Each time, the case was closed without further action, leaving neighbors with unease they learned to ignore. Inside the house, Emily lived a quieter existence, almost invisible to those around her. She attended school sporadically, sometimes vanishing for weeks, only to return with vague explanations about illness. Teachers described her as polite but withdrawn, a girl who rarely raised her hand and kept her head low. Few classmates ever visited her home, and those who did were quick to leave, frightened by the constant barking and the heavy presence of the Rottweilers. Emily never complained outwardly, but her silence spoke volumes to those who paid attention. Mark appeared to see his daughter's fear as weakness. He often left her with the dogs while he worked odd jobs, telling anyone who asked that Emily was perfectly capable of handling them. To him, it was a way to teach responsibility, a way to toughen her up. But to outsiders, it seemed like something darker, forcing a child into an environment where danger lurked in every corner. The tension between father, daughter, and dogs simmered just beneath the surface, never quite boiling over but always threatening to. As days turned into years, the Harris family became part of the neighborhood's background noise. People grew used to the sound of barking echoing across the cul-de-sac at night. They grew used to Emily's absence from gatherings and Mark's cold nods in passing. On the surface, the family blended into the suburban rhythm, but whispers carried through backyard fences and late-night conversations. Something about that house felt different. Something about those dogs felt wrong, and though no one could predict the tragedy to come, many admitted later that the signs had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. The air was thick with heat that summer evening, the kind that clung to skin and made the quiet streets feel heavy and still. Most of the neighbors were inside, their windows glowing with television light, the hum of air conditioners filling the silence. At the Harris home, however, a darker atmosphere was taking shape. Mark had left earlier in the day, telling a neighbor he was running errands, but hours passed with no sign of his return. Inside the house, Emily was left alone, Her only company, the two Rottweilers her father cherished so much. For most children, solitude was manageable, but for Emily it came with a constant edge of dread. The sound of claws clicking on the hardwood floors, the deep growls echoing in the narrow halls. Every noise was a reminder that she was never truly safe. As the evening dragged on, neighbors later recalled hearing something that froze them in place. At first, it was just the muffled sound of movement, the dogs barking more aggressively than usual. Then came the scream, piercing and desperate, a cry that carried across the cul-de-sac before suddenly cutting off. A silence followed, so complete that some wondered if they had imagined it. But then the barking returned, frenzied and violent, followed by another scream that ended far too quickly. Several residents rushed outside, scanning the Harris property, yet the curtains were drawn, and the dim porch light revealed nothing. One neighbor dialed 911, describing the sounds of what she believed was an attack. By the time officers arrived, the house appeared unnervingly calm. The front door was unlocked, and when they entered, the scene inside told a story too horrifying for words. Emily lay motionless on the living room floor, her small frame surrounded by evidence of a brutal attack. The dogs sat nearby, their expressions disturbingly neutral, as though nothing had happened. There was no panic in them, no wild energy, just a quiet, eerie stillness that unsettled even the most seasoned officers. Emergency responders moved quickly, but it was too late. Emily's injuries were too severe, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The responding officers, hardened by years of violence and tragedy, later admitted the image stayed with them long after that night. To many, it seemed like a heartbreaking accident, the kind of tragedy that happens when dangerous animals and vulnerable children mix. But for investigators, the unease began almost immediately. Certain details felt off, small pieces that didn't fit neatly into the story of a simple dog attack. The living room showed signs of struggle, but not in the way one might expect. Furniture wasn't overturned and objects weren't scattered wildly. Instead, there were claw marks on locked doors, scratches that suggested Emily had tried to escape rooms that had been deliberately secured. Even more unsettling was the condition of the dogs. Their food bowls were empty, their behavior strangely calm, and their bodies leaner than expected for well-cared-for animals. It was as though they had been waiting, their instincts sharpened by something far more intentional than chance. Outside, police tape cordoned off the property, and neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, shocked by the horror that had unfolded in their seemingly safe community. Parents clutched their children tighter, whispering about the risks of keeping such animals, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The news spread quickly, drawing local reporters and flashing cameras to the quiet cul-de-sac. But for detectives assigned to the case, this was only the beginning. What they saw that night suggested that Emily's death might not have been the result of a tragic accident at all, but the outcome of choices made long before the attack. As investigators pieced together the events leading to Emily's death, the picture that emerged was troubling. It didn't take long to uncover a series of warnings that had been ignored or dismissed. Reports from animal control stretched back years, each one tied to complaints from neighbors who had witnessed the Rottweiler's aggression. Smaller pets had gone missing, a few turning up later with injuries too severe to ignore. Delivery drivers had filed statements about being chased from the property, narrowly escaping bites. On one occasion, a mail carrier reported being pinned against a fence by the dogs, while Mark stood nearby, watching with what the witness described as a disturbing sense of amusement. Each time, Mark managed to deflect responsibility, arguing that people were exaggerating or trespassing, convincing officials that the dogs didn't pose a serious threat. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that Emily had been living in an environment of constant fear. School records painted a portrait of a girl gradually slipping away from the life most children her age enjoyed. Attendance logs showed repeated absences, often unexplained. Teachers remembered her as nervous, distracted, and sometimes visibly anxious whenever dogs were mentioned in class discussions. A few even reached out to Mark about her well-being, but his answers were always vague. He insisted Emily was fine, that she was homeschooled when necessary, that she needed more time with her responsibilities at the house. In reality, it appeared those responsibilities were less about chores and more about being left alone with animals she could not control. Friends who had known Emily shared heartbreaking details. One girl described how Emily refused to walk home past her own street, choosing instead to take the long way around to avoid the barking that spilled from her yard. Another said Emily once confided that she slept with her bedroom door barricaded, terrified the dogs would push it open during the night. While others might have dismissed such stories as childish exaggerations, investigators began to see them as fragments of a much larger truth. The timeline of events also revealed a pattern of isolation. Mark rarely allowed Emily to spend time at friends' houses, and invitations to birthdays or sleepovers were often declined. Instead, she was confined to the home, her days revolving around the animals her father valued more than her comfort. Witnesses described her as timid, her shoulders always hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the case later suggested she was living in a constant state of hypervigilance, aware that any wrong move could provoke the dogs. But the most chilling discovery was the way Mark seemed to downplay or dismiss every sign of danger. He had been told repeatedly that his dogs were unsafe, yet he doubled down on keeping them. He had been given chances to rehome them or to secure the property more effectively, yet he refused. Instead, he framed the animals as misunderstood, insisting they were part of his family. Investigators began to wonder whether this obsession with the Rottweilers went beyond stubbornness and entered something far darker, a mindset where his need for control and image outweighed his duty to protect his daughter. What began as a tragic accident started to look more like the result of years of neglect and disturbing choices. The red flags had not only been there, they had been waving loudly, visible to anyone who cared to look, and yet Emily had been left in the middle of it all, powerless to change her circumstances. The investigation was no longer about whether the dogs were dangerous. It was about why Mark Harris had ignored every warning and what role he had truly played in the horrifying night that claimed his daughter's life. The investigation reached a critical turning point when forensic teams spent more time inside the Harris home. At first glance, the house looked like any other suburban dwelling. Family photographs on the walls, toys tucked away in corners, and dishes piled in the sink. But as experts moved room to room, they uncovered details that shifted the narrative from accident to something far more disturbing. Behind closed doors, the home revealed itself as a place of control and confinement rather than warmth and safety. Several rooms had locks not only on the outside but reinforced from the inside, as if certain areas were designed to keep people or animals in. Investigators noticed scratch marks across these doors, the kind left by claws dragging desperately at wood. The pattern suggested Emily had tried to reach safety but had been trapped in an environment that left her with nowhere to go. The most unsettling discovery came from the dogs' living arrangements. The Rottweilers were housed in makeshift cages, built from chain-link fencing inside the garage. Food and water bowls sat empty, their condition indicating neglect rather than accident. Veterinary experts called to review the dogs' health noted they were underfed, leaner than expected, and unusually agitated. It raised the possibility that their behavior on the night of the attack had not been random, but shaped by prolonged hunger and mistreatment. The idea that the animals had been intentionally primed for aggression turned the case in a chilling direction. As detectives pieced together these findings, they began to see Mark Harris not simply as a negligent father, but as someone who may have deliberately created the conditions for tragedy. Witness statements supported this darker theory. One neighbor recalled overhearing Mark boasting about how his dogs would attack on command. Another recounted seeing Emily standing frozen in the yard while the animals circled her, with Mark watching nearby instead of intervening. For prosecutors, these details painted a horrifying picture. A father who treated his daughter's fear as weakness and used the dogs as instruments of discipline and control. Digital evidence added another layer. Investigators found online searches on Mark's computer about dog dominance and breaking fear with exposure. Phrases suggesting he had been researching ways to force Emily to confront her terror of the Rottweilers. Journals belonging to Emily revealed entries written in shaky handwriting about being left alone with the dogs, about nights she couldn't sleep because of growling outside her door, about a gnawing sense that her father was testing her in ways she couldn't escape. These writings, combined with the physical evidence, shifted the case firmly away from accident and toward intentional neglect, perhaps even cruelty. The prosecution's theory grew more chilling as the pieces fell into place. They argued that Mark had left Emily alone with the dogs that night not because he trusted her or believed she was safe, but because he wanted to see how far she could be pushed. Whether he believed it was a form of discipline, a twisted experiment in strength, or simply a disregard for her life, the outcome was the same. Emily had been abandoned in a deadly situation. The attack was not random, but the product of choices made deliberately, over time, by a man who valued control more than his daughter's safety. By the time this evidence was presented, the community's initial shock had hardened into outrage. What they once saw as a tragic accident began to look like a crime that had been years in the making. The haunting truth settled over the case. Like a shadow, Emily's death wasn't simply caused by dangerous animals, but by a father who had allowed, and perhaps engineered, the danger to flourish under his own roof. The trial of Mark Harris drew crowds that packed the courthouse, each day unfolding like a grim theater of betrayal and neglect. Reporters filled the hallways, cameras flashing whenever Mark was led inside in shackles, his expression a mixture of defiance and emptiness. Prosecutors wasted no time laying out their case, presenting a timeline that left jurors stunned. They described years of ignored warnings, a father who placed his own obsession with power and control above the safety of his child, and a house that had been transformed into a place of fear rather than refuge. Photographs of the crime scene were displayed, images of claw-marked doors, empty food bowls, and the lifeless body of a girl who never stood a chance. The silence in the courtroom during those moments was absolute, as though the weight of what had happened pressed down on everyone present. Expert witnesses testified that the dogs were not inherently unpredictable, but had been conditioned by neglect and stress to respond violently. One animal behaviorist explained how deliberate underfeeding heightened aggression, making them more likely to attack. Forensic psychologists painted a picture of Mark's mindset, arguing that he had been obsessed with control, both over the animals and his daughter. The testimony was chilling in its detail, suggesting that Emily's death had been years in the making rather than the result of a single night's poor decision. The defense struggled to counter this avalanche of evidence. They attempted to frame the attack as a tragic accident, claiming Mark had loved his daughter but underestimated the risks. Yet their arguments rang hollow against the mountain of documents, photographs, and witness statements. Emily's journal entries, read aloud in court, shattered any illusion of safety. Her words spoke of fear, sleepless nights, and the growing belief that her father would never protect her. These entries became the heart of the trial, a voice for a girl silenced too soon. When the jury withdrew to deliberate, the wait was short. Within hours, they returned with their decision. Guilty on charges of manslaughter and aggravated child neglect. The announcement brought gasps and tears from the gallery. Mark sat motionless as the sentence was read. Decades in prison, a punishment many still felt did not fully measure the depth of his betrayal. The judge spoke sharply, condemning him not only for failing as a parent, but for creating the very conditions that led to his daughter's death. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered in quiet reflection. Parents held their children close, shaken by the reminder of how trust could be twisted into something deadly. The Rottweilers were euthanized under court order, a decision that sparked its own controversy, but ultimately brought closure to neighbors who had long feared the animals. For many, however, it was not the dogs they blamed, but the man who had allowed danger to grow unchecked within his own home. In the months that followed, Emily's story echoed far beyond the Florida suburb where it began. Advocacy groups cited her case as a call for stricter animal control laws and better child protection oversight. Documentaries and news programs dissected the tragedy, each one returning to the haunting question: how many warnings must be ignored before action is taken? For those who knew her, the legacy was more personal. They remembered a quiet girl with watchful eyes, someone who carried more fear than any child should. Her story became a reminder that danger does not always arrive from strangers or dark alleys, but can grow quietly, hidden in plain sight, inside the walls of a family home.